Sometimes the feeling comes without warning, in the middle of an ordinary day, like a faint internal displacement difficult to explain. It could be an unexpected silence between two thoughts, a strange pause in the automatic rhythm of life, or the impression that something invisible is trying to get your attention, not through words, but through simple presence. Many people have felt this, even if they never stopped to think about it. Name the experience. Life goes on, but something seems to be watching closely, following in silence. Have you ever noticed that certain encounters don't seem like chance? That some paths they open naturally, while others close, no matter how much effort they make? In a few rare moments, the world seems to breathe at the same pace as you, and for a brief instantly, everything falls into place without the need for explanation. These moments don't usually last a long time, but leave a deep mark, as if revealing a more subtle layer of reality. We live, immersed in constant noise, goals, screens, and urgencies. Still, beneath in all this turmoil, something old keeps manifesting. It's in the wind that crosses the spaces without asking permission, in water that finds its way without resistance, in sunrise that happens every day regardless of whether there is anyone to watch him. This silent movement requires neither belief nor intellectual effort. It just invites attention. Maybe you've already felt this when entering a simple place but full of tranquility, or when performing an everyday gesture and realizing for a moment that something beyond of the visible was also touched. This feeling often goes back to childhood, when the world seemed alive, attentive, and deeply close. What changes when we treat life as a problem to be solved, and we start to see it as an encounter continuous? There is a way of walking in which the invisible is neither distant nor separate. He reveals in small gestures, in silent reverence, in caring for what cannot be seen, but is felt clearly. In this video, we are not looking for rigid answers or closed definitions. The proposal is to walk through gentle questions, listen to nature as a mirror, and perhaps remember something that was always present but was forgotten in the midst of the noise. If you feel like there is something invisible accompanying your days, even without know how to explain, this path is also yours. There is something that has accompanied us since before we learned to name the world. It is not a clear idea, nor an organized belief, but a sense of presence that arises when we are truly attentive. In many moments of adult life, this call becomes almost imperceptible, drowned out by excess stimuli, commitments, and expectations. Still, it never disappears completely. He waits, and when finds a crack of silence, manifests itself. This call does not come from outside as an order, nor from within as a desire. Immediate. It appears in the space between things. In that interval where we are not trying to control, explain, or achieve something, may appear during a walk without destiny, in contact with the earth, in the distracted observation of the sky, or even in a moment of tiredness in which the body asks for a break. It's as if life, for a brief moment, left from being a sequence of tasks to being a flow again. In childhood, this call tends to be more evident. Children do not separate the world into rigid categories. A tree is not just a tree, but a shelter, a mystery, a silent company. Water is not just a resource, but something alive, worthy of attention. Over time, we learn to name, measure, and use. And in this process, something subtle becomes loose, not because it disappears, but because we stop listening. The invisible does not impose itself. It doesn't compete with the noise of the modern world. Therefore, many people go their entire lives without realizing that there is something beyond the surface of their minds. Events. Others feel it, but don't know how to integrate this perception into their routine. They try to fit it into rigid explanations or dismiss it as imagination. However, this call does not require definition. He asks for a relationship. When we start paying attention, something changes in the way we walk through life. Places stop being just scenes and start to have a presence. Everyday gestures gain a different weight, not because they become great, but because they become carried out conscientiously. The simple act of entering a space, of touching the water, of breathing deeply can become a point of reconnection. This calling also manifests as a sense of silent guidance, not in sense of predicting the future or guaranteeing results, but as a sense of alignment. There are choices that seem lighter, even when they are not easy. There are paths that, although uncertain, they convey a strange tranquility, and there are others who, despite although they promise security, they generate persistent discomfort. Learn to listen to this signal. Subtle requires slowing down and accepting that even you needs to be rationalized. In modern life, we are trained to seek reassurance, explanation, and control. The calling invisible points in the opposite direction. It suggests trust and flow, respect for cycles, and openness to what cannot be fully understood. It's not about abandoning the reason, but to recognize its limits. There are dimensions of experience that only reveal themselves when we stop forcing answers. This is the beginning of a comeback, a return not to a specific place, but to a way of broader and more sensitive presence. Along this path, it will not be necessary to adopt new labels or beliefs. Just cultivate attention, reverence, and listening, because what calls us is not far away. He has always been here, waiting for the moment when we would be willing to understand. When we observe nature carefully, we realize that everything seeks balance without conscious effort. Water doesn't need to learn to flow, wind doesn't need to be instructed to get around obstacles, and stations do not rush to arrive ahead of time. There are a silent order that is not imposed by force, but by harmony. This movement nature reveals something essential about human life itself, something that often we ignore when trying to control every detail of existence. Over time, we accumulate invisible layers. They are not just objects or commitments, but emotional impressions, unfulfilled expectations, repeated tensions and thoughts that never find rest. Just like a river can become cloudy when it receives excess waste, the mind also loses clarity when there is no space to dispose of what has already fulfilled its role. Purity in this sense is not related to perfection, but to the free circulation of what comes in and what goes out. In modern life, we are encouraged to retain emotions, opinions, hurts, images of who we should be. Little is said about the importance of letting go, of allowing certain experiences follow their natural course until they dissolve. Nature, however, teaches simple way. Nothing stays fixed without getting sick. Standing water rots, stagnant air it suffocates, and a tree that doesn't move with the wind ends up breaking. Inner harmony begins when we recognize this principle in ourselves. Don't is about eliminating thoughts or feelings, but allowing them to pass without become a permanent address. When we resist, we create rigidity. When we observe and we let it flow, we create space. This space is what allows for clarity. It is in Him that life breathes again within us. Simple gestures carry this reorganization capacity. Washing your hands, for example, it can just be an automatic habit, or it can become a moment of mindfulness in which contact with water symbolizes the release of accumulated excess. Walk in silence, feeling your body moving, hearing the sounds around you without classifying them. All of this acts as a form of subtle cleansing, not because it changes the external world, but because it restores the internal relationship with Him. Harmony does not require isolation or withdrawal from everyday life. It can be cultivated in the middle of tasks as long as there is presence. When we are attentive, we realize that the world responds differently. The situations are still challenging, but are now faced with less resistance. There is a calm acceptance that neither everything needs to be resolved immediately, nor completely understood. Inner purity is above all a state of availability to feel without getting attached, to act without forcing, to listen without judging. It is in this state that the invisible finds space to express itself more clearly, not as something extraordinary but as a natural continuity of life. By aligning ourselves with this flow, we stop fight against the world and start to walk with it, recognizing that the true harmony is not in controlling, but in consciously participating in the movement that has always been ongoing. Everything that exists is in motion, even when it appears immobile. The mountains are slowly transformed, rivers never repeat the same shape, and the human body renews without us noticing. Yet much of human suffering arises from attempt to interrupt this flow. We create attachment to states, people, identities, and moments, as if they could remain intact. When change comes, and it always arrives, we react with resistance, as if something had gone wrong. Impermanence is not an error of the world, but its very nature. Nothing was done to last the same way forever. When we look more closely at life, we realize that everything follows cycles of emergence, transformation, and dissolution. The problem it is not in this movement, but in the expectation of permanence that we project onto it. We want the good things to stay, the difficult things to disappear quickly, and the reality fits our preferences. This constant tension creates internal wear and tear. Detachment does not mean indifference, errance, nor abandonment of what matters. He points to a lighter relationship with experiences. It is possible to care without possessing, to love without imprison, build without demanding absolute guarantees. When we understand that everything is fleeting, each moment gains more value, not less. The presence intensifies precisely because we know that nothing can be repeated in the same way. In everyday life, impermanence manifests itself in simple ways. One day begins and ends. A mood changes over the hours. A phase ends without asking permission. Often, we only realize this when something has already happened. The invitation is to notice while happens. Be aware of what is changing without trying to interrupt the process. This requires confidence, not in the result, but in the movement of life itself. Much of modern anxiety arises from the desire for control. We plan excessively, we mentally review the past and anticipate future scenarios such as form of protection. However, this constant attempt to fix what is fluid generates the effect opposite. The more we try to hold on, the more tense we become. The more we resist the change, the more it destabilizes us. Detachment appears as a silent response to this wear and tear. When we let go, something unexpected happens. The energy previously spent on resistance is release. The mind becomes clearer. Decisions are made more quickly. Sensitivity, and less fear. Not because everything becomes predictable, but because we learn to trust in one's own ability to cross the unknown. This is a learning experience profound, which does not happen all at once, but is built little by little in daily practice. Perhaps you have already experienced a time when, upon accepting an inevitable change, you felt relief rather than loss, as if something heavy had been lifted, even though the situation remained defiant. This is the sign that detachment does not impoverish the experience, but it makes it more honest. It returns us to the present, the only place where life truly lives, happens. If this idea resonates with you, if something inside recognizes this truth without needing explanations, it is a sign that deeper listening has already begun. Impermanence leaves from being a threat and becomes a silent teacher, teaching how to live with more lightness, attention, and respect for natural cycles. By accepting that everything changes, we make space to walk with life instead of fighting it, allowing each step to fulfill your role and move forward when the time comes. When we think about what is sacred, we often imagine something distant, elevated, or separated from ordinary life. We create the idea that deep meaning can only be found in extraordinary moments, in specific places, or in experiences rare. However, when we look more closely, we realize that this separation is artificial. Everyday life, with its simple and repeated gestures, carries a deep silence that usually goes unnoticed, precisely because it is always present. Reverence is not born of grandeur, but of attention. It arises when we go through the days in automatic mode, and we begin to realize what is really happening around us. A consciously taken step is not just a displacement in space. Carefully prepared food is not just fuel. A respected environment is not just a setting. When attention changes, the quality of experience changes together. In modern life, we are conditioned to speed up. We do several things at the same time, always with the feeling that we are late for something more important. At this rate, details disappear, sounds become noise, spaces become functional, and gestures lose meaning. Reverence for everyday life is a movement opposite. She slows down not to delay life, but to fully inhabit it. Small actions can become points of reconnection when performed with presence. Opening a door, for example, can be just a mechanical act, or it can be a moment of conscious transition between one space and another. Cleaning an environment can be just an obligation, or it can become a gesture of care for the place we live in. Shelters. These actions do not change externally, but the way we relate to they change profoundly. Reverence also involves respect for what we do not control. The climate, the weather, the body cycles, mood that varies for no apparent reason. Instead of fighting these movements, we can learn to observe them and adjust our rhythm. There are days of expansion and collection days. There are moments of clarity and moments of internal silence. Recognizing this not as failure, but as part of the flow, reduces internal friction. When we cultivate this posture, something subtle reorganizes. The constant feeling of separation decreases. We are no longer on one side, trying to dominate the other's life. We started to participate. The world stops being an object to be used and becomes a relationship field. This change does not require new knowledge, it's a provision different from what is already here. Reverence for everyday life does not eliminate challenges, but it changes our position in the face of them. Instead of reacting automatically, we create a small space between the stimulus and the response. In this space, the possibility of choice arises. That's where care comes in, manifests itself, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural consequence of attention. By recognizing the value of the simple, we stop looking for meaning only in the distant, and we begin to find it in the next gesture, the next breath, the next encounter. Everyday life reveals itself as a living territory, where the invisible manifests itself in a discreet way but constant. And the more we learn to respect these little moments, the more the realization becomes clear that we are not separate from what we seek. The path has always been beneath our feet, just waiting for us to learn how to walk with presence. After going through the recognition of impermanence and care for everyday life, the need for reintegration naturally arises, not as a return to something lost, but as a silent realignment with that which has always been there. A spiritual reintegration does not happen outside of ordinary life, nor does it require a break with the world. It happens when we stop perceiving ourselves as separate from the flow that sustains. For a long time, we learn to see ourselves as isolated individuals, responsible for control, decide and sustain everything alone. This perception creates a constant tension, as if we were always on guard against the possibility of error or loss. A reintegration begins when we recognize that we are part of something bigger, not in the abstract sense, but in a concrete and everyday way. The air we breathe, the ground we maintain, the rhythm of the body and the seasons continue to operate regardless of our will. When this understanding deepens, life stops being a permanent battle and it becomes a collaboration. Not because the challenges disappear, but because our relationship with them changes. Instead of reacting rigidly, we begin to respond with sensitivity. Instead of imposing rhythm, we learn to listen. This internal adjustment creates a sense of belonging that does not depend on external validation. Spiritual reintegration also manifests as a return to center, not a center fixed, but a moving balance point, which adjusts according to circumstances. There are moments of action and moments of reflection. There are periods of clarity and periods of silence. When we accept this alternation, we stop demanding absolute coherence, and we begin to respect the natural movement of human experience. This process does not require major declarations or abrupt changes. It builds on small gestures repeated with awareness. A moment of pause before reacting. 1. Be more careful with the space we occupy. A silent recognition of what it doesn't depend on us. These seemingly simple gestures have a profound effect because they reorganize the way we position ourselves in life. Over time, this posture generates serenity, not an artificial calm, but a tranquility that comes from trust in the process. We know that not everything will be understood, resolved, or controlled, and it ceases to be a problem. The need to immediate responses decrease. Attention turns to what is present, to what can be done now, without excessively anticipating what will come later. Spiritual reintegration does not separate us from the world. On the contrary, it returns us to Him with more presence. We come to realize that every encounter, every place, and every situation, they are part of a network of living relationships. Nothing is completely isolated. Everything participates of the same continuous movement. By recognizing this, we stop fighting the current and we learn to walk together, adjusting our pace, trusting the rhythm and allowing the life reveals itself without the need for imposition. This state is not permanent, nor does it need to be. It arises and dissipates, just like everything else. More. But every time we return to it, even for a moment, something strengthens internally. A silent confidence, a sense of belonging, the calm certainty that, even in the midst of change, there is a possible alignment between who we are, what we live, and the invisible flow that passes through us. Upon arriving here, something has already silently reorganized, not as a conclusion definitive, but as a change of attitude towards the experience of living itself. When we look back, we realize that nothing that was explored points to a new belief system or foreclosed responses. The path taken was, in fact, an invitation to remember. Remember that life doesn't just happen in the big ones events, but in the way we inhabit each moment. There is a discrete wisdom that manifests itself when we stop, demanding so much from the world and ourselves. It does not promise control, nor does it eliminate uncertainty, but it does offer something more stable: presence. Being present does not mean understanding everything, but being available for what is presented. It is in this state that the invisible ceases to appear distant and becomes recognized as part of the fabric of everyday life. Along this journey, we saw that harmony is not the absence of conflict, but the ability adjustment. That purity is not elimination, but circulation. That detachment is not loss, but freedom of movement. And that reverence does not require complex rituals, just attention sincere. These perceptions do not need to be maintained by force. They arise naturally whenever there is internal space for listening. Life will continue to bring challenges, unexpected changes, and moments of doubt. This does not change. What can change is the way we walk through all this. Instead, from hardening, we can learn to become flexible. Instead of resisting, we can observe. Instead of trying to dominate, we can participate. This subtle adjustment transforms the experience without need to transform it externally. When we walk this way, something curious happens. The world seems less hostile and more cooperative, not because it has changed, but because our stance has changed. We pass to perceive signals where before there was only noise. We started to respect pauses where before there was just a rush, and we begin to recognize that there is a silent intelligence operating at intervals, sustaining the cycles, following each step. If this way of looking at life resonated with you, if something here resonated without, if you need convincing, consider continuing this journey with renewed attention. Sign up and stay with us, not to accumulate answers, but to deepen the listen and care for what you don't see but what you feel. Because perhaps what we call destiny is not a fixed line drawn ahead, but a constant dialogue with subtle forces that have accompanied us since the beginning. And maybe the true spiritual path is not getting somewhere, but learning to recognize, step by step, the silent whispers that guide us as we walk.